just to begin with, just kind of a little background of my own experience with time, with kind of the temporal realm. I've always been horrible at time management. As far back as I can remember, I've struggled to get places on time. Um, and, of course, the world likes to make you think there's something wrong with you if this is kind of your personality. And rather than thinking that there is something quote unquote wrong with this, even though we may rely on people to be on time, and I get it, I strive to be on my class, to become arrive at my classes on time, and but I do now, um, and it got worse with meditation. Maria's laughing. We've talked about this before. I think your experience is the same, right? It's not uncommon that when you meditate regularly and you begin to have sort of a really sort of open experience of meditation, of mindfulness, of deep practice, that actually your sense of time can sort of drift away from what we call chronological time. And so I asked Leslie, my teacher, one day, many years ago, I said, so I'm suspicious here. I feel like the more we practice, or the more I practice, the worse my time issues get. And in this lovely South African accent, she said, "Well, most definitely." She said, "This is why you have to be more attuned to the temporal realm, not less." Yeah, it almost makes us have to have more agency. And for a while, I wore a watch to help me. I still do sometimes. It doesn't help because my mind is different in some way, particularly after a lot of practice. So I've always been compelled by why this may be, and by kind of observing myself in meditation, knowing just a little bit about quantum mechanics here and there, began to realize that when my mind is still, when it's quiet, when it's unmoving, the sense of time does tend to shift because of the stillness. After all, movement creates time. This sense of time. So we know that time is experienced through quantum mechanics. Time is experienced differently based on where you're located. The higher off the ground you are, and I did some research about this today. It's called time dilation. It's part of quantum theory, that the further you are away from Earth's gravitational center, time begins to slow down. This is why space travel, you can go out into space and actually everything slows down exponentially. So there's this theory you see in science fiction films that people don't age as fast. They come back 10 years later or 50 years later, and everyone they know is gone, and they're still young looking and such. This has its roots in Einstein's theory of relativity. So what we're saying here, and what Einstein himself realized, is that time is relative. It is relative. It's not as certain and unchanging as we think it is. Now, that difference between being sort of way up high in sort of the subspace area above the biosphere and being like down in a cave, the difference is pretty negligible. It's not a huge difference, but there is a bit of a difference. And every year, apparently the world clocks have to sync up again. Is it enough to experience that shift? Probably not. And yet the point here is that what I call still time, the still time of mindfulness or meditation practice, makes sense. Because the more quiet the mind is, the more time seems to slow down. The faster the mind is, relative to some fluctuations or the movement, the activity of the mind, time speeds up. This is why it may be that if you practice, some people may be practicing for half an hour. Sometimes we've practiced on these calls for, almost 40 minutes. And people might say, wow, that only felt like it was 10 minutes. For other people who have really busy minds, really active minds, restless, agitated minds, it may feel like an eternity. One other interesting little tidbit from quantum theory is the tests that they've done with two clocks, a clock that is stationary and unmoving, and then a clock that is orbiting, circling that first clock. And what they've found is that time passes more quickly with a stationary clock. In a similar way, when we're meditating and the mind is very still, time goes by more quickly. And the clock that is rotating around that initial clock, the time is slow. In other words, the mind being busy and active, time passes or appears to pass more slowly. This is a theory anyway, and this is me kind of relating this to contemplative practice. And movement slows our sense of time passing, activity, that kind of thing. Stillness means that time passes more quickly. So this is rooted in quantum mechanics. Pretty weird, right? That clocks will not move at the same pace. Part of it has to do with velocity, and the other part has to do with gravity. So the theory, and we don't need to know this for meditating, right? We can ruminate. It can just be another point of rumination. Like, how does this work? It doesn't matter. Let it go. Or who wants to know? That's the question. But two clocks. Clocks are sort of taking their cue from gravity as well as from velocity. And as the Earth spins, we have gravity, we have velocity. So if you've ever seen a science fiction film where the spaceship has a rotating part to it, usually that rotating part is what produces the gravity for the spaceship. And this is, I don't know if anybody has ever wondered that or seen a film like that. Anyway, the interesting thing is that 2,500 years ago, located within Buddhism, we have sort of these views of time as being relative, as almost being negligible. And we can think of it in terms of the relative and the ultimate. Back when, prior to the Greek mythological period, the deity Kronos, I don't know if any of you have studied this, but Kronos, sort of the pre-mythology of the pre-ancient Greek period, Kronos was thought to be circular, not the deity, but the notion of time was not straight. It was not a linear thing, but it was circular. It was sort of going in these cycles. So when we think of time being measured by minutes, we have increments. We have what we can call chronological time. But a moment in time, a moment is experiential. It's not an increment. It's not a measuring increment. It's an experience. So a moment of time isn't going to match up perfectly with a minute in time, even if that moment lasts a minute. Our experience is relative to it. And that minute itself is relative to placement. So what we're doing here is we're blowing apart any sense of stability we may find in the clock, but we're going to try to open up this kernel of what we can call a timeless sense of awareness, of presence, that we access in our meditation. There is this term, eternal present, in mindfulness practice, in meditation, meaning that we are always in the moment, in this present moment. Whether the mind is flying into the future or into the past, all of that ruminating is happening in this moment. And this is the truth of every moment. So this is what's called the eternal present. Um, in the Vibhanga, which is one of the early Pali texts in Buddhism, it translates as the Book of Analysis. It's part of the earliest of the Pali texts in the canon. There is a teaching where the Buddha says that experiential time itself is relative, and large expanses of time pass quickly. So what we're talking about here is we're starting to get a sense of placement, a frame of reference for our lives. Yeah. Um, Nirvana, this quality of what we can call sort of the enlightened state, itself is timeless. Here we move into the ultimate, from the relative into the ultimate, these two ways of perceiving reality in Buddhism. And it is seen to be beyond time. It is because it is unconditioned. Since time is always conditioned, it is always part of the relative. So we can experience this when we're in a deep state of stillness in the body. It doesn't mean that there is no movement around us. It means that we are centering ourselves deeply at the heart of that which is still and changeless, this unchanging presence. In ancient India, you have this notion of kala or kali. This is a term for time. Literally in Sanskrit, it means time. And I don't know if any of you have heard of Kali, the great sort of um, wrathful female deity, largely because she is linked to time, the destruction of time as well, as are some of the other wrathful deities. Mahakala, the great time, that's literally what it means. He's also seen to be the eater of time. Why is this? Why would time have anything to do with wisdom or with something auspicious in this way? And largely it's because at the heart of these teachings, by eating time or by destroying time, we are destroying the relative conditioned experience that leads to suffering. And we are accessing something much deeper, much more expansive, that is more fully present with unconditional awareness. This is why time is also part of that conditioned phenomena. So these beings are trying to help us in many ways, as fearsome as they are. It's very interesting, yeah, this notion. Kala chakra in Tibetan Buddhism, in Vajrayana Buddhism, this notion of wheel of time, which is exactly what it means, is also that process of unraveling, of dismantling, if you will, all of the conditions that lead to suffering and accessing the energy of awakening and deep compassion, deep love, unobstructed, unconditioned love. So anyway, we are now, from a Buddhist standpoint, in what's called Kali Yuga. Yeah, this is a yuga is an era. So Kali being this time, this word for time, and yuga, era, is a long time era, quote unquote. And it's easy to forget that we're at the center where we are now. Actually, we are always at the center, wherever we are, of this time era. And yet it can feel as if we are moving in a straight line forward. Let's instead think of ourselves at the center of this great era of a spiral, of a circular process. Yeah, it's not somewhere in the quote unquote future, because if we think of timeless as circular, or time as circular, we will come back around, only we'll be in a different level. We are never the same in 2 moments. Never the same in 2 moments. Even if we feel like we're not progressing, or, oh, here's this thing coming up again, you're different than you were the last time it came up in some way. It may not be perceptual, but there is a difference. This is why it's not a plain circle going around, but it's more of a spiral. Sometimes the spiral goes up, sometimes it kind of goes back down a little bit. But I think this is a very helpful way to think about time as circular. There's this cool little quote too I wanted to share with you by Suzuki Roshi, the great Zen master. He said, "You may say, I must do something this afternoon, but actually there is no this afternoon. At 1 o'clock you will eat your lunch. To eat your lunch is itself 1 o'clock." Anyway, a little comic relief in there. I hope you found that as funny as I. It doesn't look like that went over very well. So, just a couple more things before we sort of move into practice, specifically around how we might work with time. Yeah, I think the first thing that the reason that I'm sharing a lot of these sort of ruminations with you are that to give a perspective, the time perception, it's going to be relative. It's not going to be as fixed as maybe we've been taught to believe it is. And it's okay if we experience it differently. As my teacher said, it just means, as Leslie said, it just means you have to pay more attention to the structure of time if you have appointments, yeah? And you have to develop skillful means to do things. For practice, however, when we talk about expanding awareness, and we talk about this frequently, as we do our guided practice, sometimes it's like, okay, allow awareness to deepen and open. And many times in mindfulness teachings, we'll hear, be in the present with your awareness. Well, that's true. But we also want to be timeless. So we want to be present, but expanding awareness isn't just about this moment, but really all moments. When we widen the circle of our mindfulness, of our capacity to be aware of our witnessing, or widening the circle to include all time as well. This is really what is meant by all living beings. We're not just talking about all living beings now, we're talking about all living beings that have been and perhaps are now in other forms, and all living beings that will be. The more we're able to really see ourselves as, or rather the reach of our awareness as boundless, we're also not bounded by time. Part of this is cultivating patience. What Shantideva in the Bodhicharyavatara, or in the Bodhisattva, the way of the Bodhisattva, calls armor-like. Why patience, as we cultivate a sense of patience, is to be armor-like. It actually helps us to slow down all of that rushing, all of that movement, and more easily settle into stillness, even in the midst of mind stuff coming up, coming and going, another thing coming and going. When we can cultivate a sense of patience in the heart and in mind, stillness arises more easily. And within that stillness, awareness opens more easily. And within the opening of that awareness, expanded awareness arises more easily. We don't need to be bound any longer by kind of the temporal shapes that govern our lives. That's all waiting for us when we come back. Yeah. So exploring these different dimensions, if you will. The quantum theory tells us there's a lot to what the Buddha realized around time, that it is relative, and that awareness itself can move beyond even that relativity to a much deeper, more sort of whole experience where all times are held in the embrace of our love and our awareness.